Okay, we are recording. Welcome to Business Law Today. Today we start constitutional law. I will, from here on out, I've come up with a better solution than what I've been doing, and that's been to just send you announcements with links to things. Let's just simplify things, and I'm going to just start putting all of that information in the prepare folder for each week. If it's going to be live, I'll have the link in there. If it's recorded, I'll just have the URL to the recording in the prepare folder as well. So that way you don't have to check announcements and look for those. You'll just see it in the prepare folder, which is probably what I should have been doing from the beginning, but we're all learning together. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And let's start this off today with a quiz. So with this one, you've got 60 seconds. I want you to tell me if you feel that the government has the authority to regulate how many tomatoes you grow in your backyard and tear them out if you grow too many. So think of your grandma growing tomatoes in her backyard. Can the government come pull those out if they think that she has grown too many tomatoes? All right. Take a couple more seconds on that.
Oh, it has the authority? No.
All right. So getting down to about 10 more seconds. Oh, everybody's answered already. So let's go ahead and close this up and let's check out your responses. All right, so 5 say yes, 17 say no. Any of you just want to kind of volunteer, defend your position, whatever it was?
Well, in the reading, it mentioned in the Commerce Clause about federal laws regulating how much wheat someone could grow. And I figure there's not much difference between wheat and tomatoes.
All right, so you're thinking of the Wickern case, and yeah, the government was regulating wheat. So you're saying yes, the government probably has authority to regulate your grandma's tomatoes. All right. Anybody that's picked no want to defend that?
Yeah, I'll go for it. I also remember reading that. I just think, again, going off of this is a living constitution as well, that we're not in a depression right now. And also we have the right for property. And I believe that if it's, not any illegal drugs, you should be able to grow the kind of food that you'd like to grow.
Yeah, in the quantities that you want to grow them. So yeah, that makes sense. And this one, this is I'm not going to give you the answer just yet. We're gonna wait a little bit till we get over to the Commerce Clause. But I think it's a good introduction to kind of this idea that sometimes there is an inherent conflict even within the Constitution and the rights that we enjoy as U.S. citizens. And by the way, the Constitution just doesn't apply to U.S. citizens. It applies to people within the United States. And so I think you understand this too. Sure, the Second Amendment ensures freedom of religion. But what if your religion says that in order to participate in your religion, you have to snort cocaine or something? Or in an actual case, smoke a substance that is deemed illegal by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency.
Yeah. Sorry, did you say Second Amendment or First Amendment?
First Amendment.
Oh, okay.
Did I say second?
I think you did.
Yeah, cool. I'm just a law professor. First Amendment, and yeah. And so oftentimes there will be this conflict between laws and constitutions, and even the Constitution with itself. And I think that as an LDS school, we understand this as well, looking back at the history of polygamy, where polygamy was seen or was a federal crime, And I've got pictures of like my great 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 grandpa or something locked up in jail for the crime of being a polygamist. And um, and yet his defense was, you know, this is part of my religion. And the government basically said, look, sometimes we have to draw the line somewhere, and polygamy's it, so you're going to jail. And so yeah, we see that now, and we've seen it in our past as well. So all right, let me get out of this. All right. And again, we'll come back to that, and we'll do some other questions here on Top Hat as well. So let me pull up our slides for the day and share this. Safari, here we go. All right, so this week, well, today, we will be talking about constitutional law. Now, constitutional law is something that we simply cannot cover in one class period. And so those of you that are interested in law school, when you go to law school, constitutional law is a semester-long class. Constitutional Law 1, there's others that you can take as well. This, we will be focusing on the constitutional law elements that affect business, primarily the Commerce Clause, but we will talk about the tax authority and some other elements as well. Okay, so with that, let's jump in here. This slide, I'm not even going to really spend that much time on it. You learned it in high school. 3 branches of government. There it is. Review that if you need to. But this is really what it's all about when it comes to business law and the Constitution. And it revolves around the Commerce Clause. Now, you read about this, and there's an interesting history here of the Commerce Clause. And I think in order to, I should do this. I'm going to pull up a whiteboard so I can show a couple of things here. Okay, so here it comes. All right. So here, what I'm going to do is, when we talk about the Commerce Clause, there's an interesting history. And again, I don't have time to go through the entire history, but of course, we had the original 13 colonies declaring independence from Great Britain. Now we call it the UK. And we start off a new country, the becoming states, and becomes the United States of America. And while the Constitution was inspired and important and thought of many things, some of the elements of the Constitution, particularly the Commerce Clause, were required because those early colonies were running into trouble. Now, I want you to imagine that you are a farmer. Let's say you're growing wheat here, and I'm going to draw a completely accurate depiction of the state of Virginia. All right, that's Virginia. There we go. All right, and you grow wheat in Virginia. Now, Virginia, the climate is great for growing many crops, and the soil is great. The climate, all of that comes together. You can have a knockout crop of wheat in Virginia. Now, contrast that with this little state up here, drawn to scale. All right, and that is the state of Delaware. All right, so there you've got Delaware. And Delaware doesn't have quite the climate that Virginia does. The growing season is shorter. The soil is not as fertile. And as a result, you just can't grow the same amount of wheat per acre that you can in Virginia. Now, you'll learn a little bit about me this semester, and one of the things that you'll find is that I have great aspirations to become a farmer someday. And so my favorite word in dealing with what we're talking about right now, agriculture, is the word bushel. All right, bushel, I haven't taken the time to look it up. I don't really know what it means. I just know that it's a bunch of something. So let's say in Virginia, for every acre that you farm, you can grow about 30 bushels. Is that how you spell bushel? I have no idea how you spell bushels. Again, remaining ignorant of these things. 30 bushels per acre in Virginia, and in Delaware, you can only do, let's say 20 bushels. So Virginia can create more, and for the cost, and the cost of shipping isn't much, so you can sell your Virginia wheat up here in Delaware for, let's say that this translates to something like $5 per bushel, whereas up here in Virginia, you can sell it for $6 a bushel. Well, again, you're the local farmer in Delaware, but everybody's going to be buying their wheat from the farmer down in Virginia. It's cheaper. And so what Delaware and other states would do, we've seen this with Wisconsin and milk. Virginia was really tobacco. And some of these smaller states where they just couldn't compete on price decided they would use Trump's favorite tactic of putting up taxes, right? Trade wars, taxing imports, all of this it kind of became the favored way to go about protecting your own local businesses. And Delaware could do this. Well, they couldn't, but the local farmers in Delaware would talk to their state senator friend or whatever and say, look, we're all going to go out of business unless you tax all of this Virginia wheat. And if you don't do that, we're going to have chaos in the state. So I understand this. The legislators of the state would go along with this in order to protect the people in the state. And so this makes sense. So Virginia wheat coming in would be taxed $2 a bushel. So now instead of $5, you're looking at $7 a bushel for the Virginia wheat. It cuts off the market, and the local Delaware farmers can continue to grow wheat and sell it. Now, there's some problems with this, and we see this consistently, not only among states, but with different countries. When you create tariffs, it's going to, well, you understand this. Now consumers, instead of getting their wheat for $5, the consumers themselves, so the cost is passed on to the consumers, and the consumers have to pay $1 extra per bushel of wheat than they otherwise would have had to. And we've just decided as a country that that's a net negative when it comes to states putting tariffs on the products of other states. And so the Commerce Clause was a great way to simply eliminate that problem. And the Commerce Clause allowed the federal government to overrule the states that were trying to regulate commerce. And this is where there's lots of cases about this. A lot of it deals with crops. In New York, it also deals with ferries between New York and New Jersey. All of these cases came together to create what we now know as the Commerce Clause. And going back to the slide here, let me bring this back up. Coming back here to the slide once it pops up onto your screen, is that basically the federal government looked at the states and said, what are you doing? Like, we're a country now. Like, stop acting, Delaware, as if, your competition is Virginia. We're one country, knock this off. And by the way, this is a good point in the class to kind of bring up something that a lot of us that were born in the US don't really understand kind of how weird our system is, especially compared to other countries in the world, where we have 50 states now. that we give the states certain authority that we don't give to the federal government. Again, I've had plenty of students. Last semester, some students from Ghana were like, "This is so weird. You're one country, and yet, every state you kind of let them do their own thing." And it wasn't until I started talking to more international students that I thought, that is kind of weird. But it goes back to our history of 13 colonies and this idea of allowing certain states rights because many states were worried about too much authority being centralized in one federal government. And it's an interesting thing. And sometimes we take that for granted. We just grow up with that. And we know that Colorado, like many of you probably know, that Colorado legalized marijuana. Idaho hasn't. And what happens if you're shipping marijuana from Oregon, where it is legal, through Idaho into Colorado? And lots of those people are getting arrested in Idaho, and they're saying, well, it's legal there and it's legal here. Like, how are we supposed to get it across? And Idaho says, we don't care. You're going to jail. And it just, this is our system. This is the federal system that we have created. And it's important for you to be aware of that. And the Commerce Clause is how we regulate this. And when I say we, I mean the federal government. So again, the purpose was to keep the states from regulating commerce from other states. And that's important too. Like what is commerce? Well, I defined it for you here on the slide. It's business dealings that affect more than one state. That's commerce. And so again, that's what we were looking at least originally. It was products of wheat. It was shipping lines. We didn't want the states putting up tariffs on other states. And so no state can do that. And that's in the Constitution. The Commerce Clause allows the federal government the authority to regulate commerce among the states. Okay, so that's the baseline, but you're going to see how convoluted this gets eventually. So let's jump ahead to the next slide. If it will go. 1 second. Okay. So, all right, let's jump to Heart of Atlanta. So Heart of Atlanta Motel was an interesting case, and I think it's not the next case of Commerce Clause. I mean, like we're jumping ahead to the 60s here, but it brings out an important point and something that I want you to understand. In this case, the Heart of Atlanta Motel, this is a motel close to the center of Atlanta, close to the, what do you call it? Like the convention centers there around downtown Atlanta. And it says motel, and lots of people think like, oh, it's a motel, it must be tiny, but it was large. And it's actually interesting, when they were arguing before the Supreme Court, they kept saying in their Georgia accents, we're just a little hotel. I can't do a Georgia accent clearly, but we're just a little motel. This law has nothing to do with us. That's not true. It was a large hotel, despite being called a motel. It was a large hospitality location in Atlanta, close to all of the important downtown offices and convention centers and everything else that you would expect to see in downtown Atlanta. And what happened is they had a strict policy of whites only in the hotel. Well, again, post-Civil War, we retained the federal system and states had certain rights, although the federal government was strengthened through and after the Civil War. The federal government in 1964 passed the Civil Rights Act that said businesses can no longer discriminate against or based on race, color, ethnicity, and some other protected classes that we'll talk about later in the semester. But really, it was a non-discrimination law coming from the federal government. Well, think about it. Think about the Commerce Clause, right? and I think what's also important to remember and understand is that our system of government reserves to the states certain powers. And this goes back to the enumerated powers issue. We say that the federal government has enumerated powers, meaning that the federal government, the Constitution has to grant the federal government certain authority to do things. If it doesn't, then we reserve the right to make those decisions to the states. All right, that's the key. And whether or not the federal government has the authority to do something really depends on what does the Constitution say. And there's only a couple options for the federal government to exercise its authority. All right, this is super big. So pay attention to this. Again, if the Constitution doesn't give the federal government authority to do something, then the federal government doesn't have the authority to do that thing, and we'll let the states decide. All right, now there are only a few situations, clauses in the Constitution that give the federal government the authority to act. And this is where we get into the power to tax and the Commerce Clause. Let's just focus on those two. There aren't many, so really it comes down to this and general welfare. But really it's, for our purposes, if the Constitution doesn't give it authority through the Commerce Clause or the taxing authority to spend for the general welfare, then the federal government does not have the authority to pass a law. And this was the defense of the Heart of Atlanta Motel in this case. And the motel, the attorneys for the motel, when this got up to the Supreme Court, said, look, Supreme Court, the federal government doesn't have the authority to pass this law because it's not anchored on anything in the Constitution. And primarily because it's a Commerce Clause case. Their argument was, we're just a hotel in Georgia. We have nothing to do with interstate commerce. We're just located in Georgia. It's not like we have a subsidiary in New York or sister hotels in Alabama. We're just one hotel in Georgia. Hence, this has nothing to do with interstate commerce. And therefore, you can't base the Civil Rights Act on the Commerce Clause to affect us because we have nothing to do with commerce. Basically, what they're doing is they're trying to take away the anchor of the Civil Rights Act and pull it out of the Commerce Clause. Why? Because it's affecting business that doesn't affect interstate commerce, is their argument. All right, now they're going to lose this argument, and I think that that's fairly simple to see, and because think about it, if you live in Chicago and you are African American and you have been asked by your boss to go to a convention in Atlanta, Georgia, how motivated are you to go to Atlanta, Georgia, knowing that it's not only the Heart of Atlanta Motel, but almost every other hotel has a policy of not renting out rooms to African Americans? Well, yeah, you're probably thinking, I don't want to go there. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court said. Sure, this is one hotel acting within its state bounds, and it's not advertising in other states. It doesn't have other companies. It's not involved in interstate commerce, meaning it's not actively engaged in like recruiting people from Alabama or New York or Chicago or Illinois or whatever. But the effects of their discriminatory policies spread beyond the state. Why? Through the example that we just talked about. It's limiting interstate movement. And that's really commerce. In an interconnected country, in an interconnected world, if your policies decrease the likelihood of interstate commerce even happening, because people are now de-incentivized to come disincentivized to come to your state because of your discriminatory policies, well, that does affect interstate commerce. And as a result, the Supreme Court said that the Civil Rights Act of 1974 is constitutional, and because these discriminatory practices have an effect on interstate commerce. Let me pause there. I don't know that I explained that very well. And so I'm curious if anybody has any questions or wants me to maybe explain something a little better there. Do you get what I'm saying? Primarily that one business operating within one state may not be involved in interstate commerce, and yet its policies do affect interstate commerce. And as a result of that broad view of that business, the Commerce Clause can have authority to regulate that business. Sorry, I should say that better. The Commerce Clause gives Congress, the federal Congress, the authority to regulate that business operating within one single state. I think that's the best way to describe it. But any questions about that so far?
How does the internet get affected, like internet sales and things like that get affected by the Commerce Clause?
A lot. So it's a great question. And it begs the question that Gavin just brought up, right? If the government can regulate business using the anchor of the Commerce Clause as the way to get authority to regulate that one single business or industry or whatever, simply because it affects what other people in other states do through commerce, well, the Commerce Clause is huge, isn't it? This means that the federal government can make pretty much any law that they want to, claim that it's based on the Commerce Clause. Why? Because if we extrapolate it enough, it's going to affect business, commerce, money. Think of it like that. Like if it affects the movement of money, well, that means that the federal government has the authority to make a law about it. Well, goodness, like what doesn't have an effect on interstate commerce? And that's key to understanding this next slide right here. Oh, and I do have a question on the bottom of this slide. Like, what? It's possible that the U.S. Supreme Court would have said, "Look, like federal government, you've gone too far. You can't pass the federal Civil Rights Act. That's something that the states have to do themselves." Well, it's possible, I suppose, that they could have decided the case that way, in which case usually states in the South would have probably kept discriminatory laws on the books. But would it still be that way? I mean, it's an interesting question because we don't really know. I think there would have been a lot of pressure from other states on the South to change their discriminatory laws eventually. It would have just taken longer. And so the fact that the Supreme Court upheld the Civil Rights Act eliminated discrimination, even of small businesses within individual states within the United States. It just hastened those discriminatory laws getting off the books. Why? Because the federal law trumps state law. And again, I think we would have eventually got there, but it was nice that this just sped things up. Okay, but it does beg that question: if the Commerce Clause can be used there, like, can it be used anywhere? Well, this leads us to the next slide, and in this slide we're going to be talking about. I don't know why this isn't really working here. Let me do this again. Brings us to the case of Lopez. Now, Lopez was an interesting case because I remember this all happening when I was a little kid. And those of you that are in the class today, some of you will remember that when you were in elementary or junior high or high school, for some of you, probably about a fourth of you, third of you, when you got close to school, there were these signs up that said, this is a gun-free zone. Now, I grew up with those in California. And again, they were around every school that if you brought a gun within a certain perimeter of a school, then you could be charged with a crime. Now, originally, this was a federal law. So this was the Federal Gun-Free Zone Act passed by Congress that said, it's illegal to have a gun within this radius of a school within the United States. Right? And that law passed. They, of course, anchored it on the Commerce Clause, saying, well, think about it. Like, how would the federal government say that regulating guns around schools affects interstate commerce? All right, start thinking about that now. I'll tell you more of the facts of this case. So Mr. Lopez had a gun in his vehicle, and I think he was driving to work. He gets pulled over by a police officer. The police officer inspects the car, sees that there's a gun, looks up, sees, Lincoln Elementary or whatever, close to where he had pulled over Mr. Lopez. And so, and I think he was pulled over for speeding or something, right? And so when Mr. Lopez gets charged, he's charged not only with speeding, but now he's charged with violating the federal law of possession of a gun within a certain radius of a local school. So he fights this. He fights this the same way, using the same legal theory, I should say, as the Heart of Atlanta Motel, saying, Judge, this federal law, the Federal Gun-Free Zone Act, is unconstitutional, and therefore it should be struck. It doesn't apply to me because, again, it's unconstitutional. And the reason it's unconstitutional is because it can't be based on the Commerce Clause. Like, having a gun near a school, what does that have to do with commerce? All right, now put yourselves in the shoes of the attorneys representing the school. All right, you have to prove that having a gun near a school affects interstate commerce. Anybody want to take a stab at this? Try to be the attorney for the federal government here to uphold the Federal Gun-Free Zone Act.
Well, I read a little about the books and about the textbook, and Tony only said it might affect the student study, and in future the student give less return in the business.
Yeah,
than supposed to be.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. And if I come back here to let me do this. If I start sharing my little whiteboard here again, what you're saying is exactly true. So they said, look, if we have let me turn this on. If we have a gun, I don't know how to draw a gun. That's a gun. All right. If we have a gun near a school, well, one, that's going to make the kids be scared. All right. So here's a scared kid. All right. So if we have guns, that's going to mean kids are scared. The potential for violence around school could make them not study as well. So again, we've got distressed children. If the kids are distressed, then, well, their grades are going to go from A's to F's. Their grades are going to go down. Why? Again, they're scared, distraught, there's guns around town, so grades go down. If their grades go down, then they're not gonna, again, I should have put here instead, whatever, I'm gonna move forward with this. So if their grades go down, then yeah, their chances for graduate school, this is Harvard. All right, Harvard. Their chance to go to Harvard goes down, and as a result of that, their money, that they're not going to make as much money in their lifetime. And I just said money, so ding, 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 Commerce Clause. All right, Commerce Clause. See, Judge. If you just follow this logical sequence of events, and you'll see that having guns next to schools affects commerce. You just have to go through our, 4 or 5 different logical steps. All right, and when this got to the Supreme Court said, it's noble what you're trying to do, like keeping kids safe, good for you. That's a positive. But this is getting too much, right? Like sure, if you're going to pass a law, it's got to be based on either the Commerce Clause or the taxing authority. But this is just too much. And so the Supreme Court actually, for like the first time in a very long time, held that a law passed by Congress, the federal government, was unconstitutional. Why? Because they said there's just too many steps here. Like it took us 5 logical steps to eventually get to decreased income earnings over a lifetime, Commerce Clause. Like that's just too much. So again, this was kind of the first time that we saw that pulling back the federal government's authority to pass laws based on the Commerce Clause. What does this mean now? Well, it means that if the federal government is going to pass a law based on the Commerce Clause, that there has to be a closer nexus, a connection between the law and interstate commerce than Lopez. Now, like most decisions from the Supreme Court, they don't say exactly how many logical steps we're able to take. They just said, this is too much. All right? And so that's the result of the Lopez case on the Commerce Clause. And again, it was kind of the first time that the Supreme Court said, simmer down, federal government, like you can't do that. Now, like I told you before, when I started this discussion about Lopez, some of you still, like this was 92, I think, was when Lopez happened. And many of you had gun-free zones when you were in elementary school. And so how is that? Like, how is it that there are still gun-free zones around your school when the Federal Gun-Free Zone Act was deemed unconstitutional? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Well, wouldn't the states jump in and say, well, the federal government might not be able to do this, but we still can?
Yeah.
Which would explain why I've never seen something like that in New Hampshire, because they love their guns here. And they'll hold tight to that.
See, and me, who grew up in Los Angeles, we don't like guns. And so even after this law was deemed unconstitutional, I was still a little kid, but I grew up with a gun-free zone around every school that I went to, because California, like if you didn't know this, I want you to know this, California is different than Idaho. And Idaho says we don't care, we don't need a gun-free zone around our schools, and there's no such thing in Idaho. They don't care. But California passed it. I think Arizona passed it. Any of you from Arizona in here have a gun-free zone? I think somebody told me somebody in Phoenix had one, but Nevada has them, I think. But many states don't, and it became a state issue. And that's an important point to remember. Just because it's deemed unconstitutional for the federal government to pass the Gun-Free Zone Act doesn't mean that the states can't. In fact, it means that the states can, and they do occasionally. So anyway, it's something like a third of the states have.
Brother Hales?
Yeah.
It kind of brings up the fact of what we were talking about earlier, just the fact of marijuana, like it's illegal federally, but that doesn't mean like other states can't do it. And so, yeah, like what we're seeing right now, maybe it will be legal nationwide, but right now that's how it is. So
yeah, the federal Congress just hasn't decided to take action on that, and so Well, I mean, they have, right? Like they've said it's illegal. What I mean is the federal government hasn't decided to decriminalize the use of marijuana yet. And so you've got states that are saying, it's legal here. This is interesting too, right? It just means, because many of you are like, how's that even possible? If the federal government says it's illegal, how can a state say it's legal here? Well, it's an issue of enforcement. The federal government isn't running the Rexburg Police Department, for example. So if Rexburg said we're going to decriminalize marijuana, well, it means that if the federal government wants to enforce it in Rexburg, for example, the federal government is going to have to send FBI agents, federal agents, to enforce a federal law here. Well, there just aren't FBI agents here in Rexburg. There are like 2 or 3 in Pocatello, but they're busy with other things. And so that right there is, it's confusing and it's weird, but the states are just saying we're not going to enforce it here, like Colorado, for example. And as a result, people aren't nervous about smoking marijuana in public in Colorado because they're not concerned about a federal agent showing up to arrest them. Again, it's the local police department, and the state has said it's legal here. So again, this is one of those things that like freaks out my international students. They're like, the U.S. is like a crazy place because of this, and yeah, I just respond and say, yep, that's how we are. Like, we are different.
Just real quick question. So if I understand correctly, then basically the states or a state can just allow things like whatever they want to allow, even though the federal says, hey, you can't do weed. Here you can do it. So
potentially, yeah. I mean, I mean, Edson's getting right to it, right? Like this is.
I'm just thinking, like, what if like, a state is governed by, I don't want to go to the extreme, but a drug dealer somehow. So that drug dealer can do just whatever he wants with the state government, however he wants, and the federal government can't do anything with that state because it's a state, can do whatever they want.
Okay, so yeah, let me use another example that kind of gets to something similar. Some of you have heard of states and cities that have become what they call sanctuary cities, right? So these are cities where they say our local police force is not going to enforce the federal immigration laws. And more than that, when we find out that somebody is in the United States illegally, we're not going to notify ICE, federal agencies involved with immigration. All right, and so I think this is kind of similar to what Edson is asking here. And the question is, like, how can they do that? Are they not usurping the federal authority over immigration? And it would be the same with enforcement of drugs, other federal crimes potentially. And the answer to that is, can the city do that? Well, President Trump has said, sure, that they can choose not to enforce federal laws, but in return, maybe the federal government will cut off funding for certain activities within that state, right? Like use the federal government's spending authority to manipulate, that's a strong word, to encourage states to take different actions on their laws or to enforce federal laws, for example. And in fact, let me give a great example that happened not too long ago. This was like 20 years ago. The state of Montana. Anybody in here from Montana? Probably not. There's like 3 people that live in Montana, right? But Montana was an interesting case because it had no speed limit. in the whole state. You guys have probably heard this before, right? Like I remember growing up as like a 6-year-old, all of us, it was like the US's version of Germany's Autobahn was like, go to Montana and you can go whatever speed you want to. Oh, Jeremiah, I'm just noticing your hands up. Did you just do that, or was that a long time ago and I didn't notice it?
It was a little bit ago, but you can finish your point and then I'll ask my question.
Okay, cool. All right, so and Montana really was like the wild, wild west of the U.S. because again, take your Porsche, go to Montana and have fun. Like again, no speed limit on the highways. On the highways, by the way, I should clarify that. And so people were going there, and it became kind of this interesting destination. People would want to go, take their fast cars, whatever. And the federal government didn't like this. The federal government said, look, Montana, well, actually, I should preface this by saying Montana requested federal funds, so money from Washington, D.C., to repair and improve and expand their highways across the state of Montana. Now, think about this. Montana, again, there's 3 people in the state, and if the state had to tax everybody in Montana to pay for the roads, well, that would be super expensive per capita because there just aren't that many people. There's like more roads than people. Like it's just ridiculous how much money people would have to spend on the roads in Montana in a state that has such a small population. So they go to the federal government and say, we'd like money for this interstate improvement. And the federal government says, you know what, we're going to give you lots of money, but you're going to have to put in a speed limit. Right? And this is basically congressional blackmail. They can do this. This gets to what we're going to talk about later about the constitutional authority to tax and spend for the general welfare. And the federal government said, yes, here's money with strings attached. And so can they do that? Yes. Montana buckled like an old lawn chair. They said, okay, we need the money, so we'll put in a speed limit. And they have, and they've ever since then have had a speed limit across Wyoming. And so to get back to kind of our discussions about that this intersection of federal laws and state laws, can President Trump force, for example, San Francisco, this is kind of his target, to change their sanctuary city laws with the use of federal funds? And as you've seen with Montana and others, they probably can. Now, whether or not they will, that takes a lot of political capital, and there's just other issues facing the country right now, if you haven't noticed. And so this hasn't become the big issue that it potentially could be. But again, yeah, I don't want to leave you totally confused, but that's kind of where we are. Like, you could have states not enforcing federal laws, and you could have states pushing their agenda onto states through the use of federal funds to encourage or blackmail, pick your word, these states to change their laws or to enforce the federal laws as they exist. All right, so yeah, we'll leave it at that. It's still confusing, but Jeremiah, why don't you ask your question?
Yeah, so on that point about Montana, there's actually a similar issue in Louisiana, but it was regarding the drinking age instead of speed limits and things like that. And so that was kind of interesting. And that happened back in the 80s with Louisiana during the Ronald Reagan administration.
Yep.
But my question is, so whenever, like how we were mentioning earlier about how Colorado enforces like one law, but then the federal does another. Mm-hmm. And with the issue of enforcement, would it then kind of break down to what the base of the case is? Like if it's like let's say like Wilson versus Colorado, and then there's the issue of a DUI under, like some form of action, but it was because of marijuana use, that wouldn't play a a relevant role in that case. But if it was, Wilson versus the United States, and then the allegation came up of him being, DUI'd with marijuana use, then that would have a relevant use in like the U.S. case versus the state case. Is that kind of like what you were referring to in forms of enforcement?
Maybe.
Do I need to be more concise with my question?
I think so. Try me again.
All right. So marijuana use, like a DUI, right? And so if it's like the individual versus the state, there's no relevance because Colorado allows marijuana use.
Let me pause you there.
Okay.
Just because they permit it doesn't mean that you're allowed to, for example, use marijuana and then drive. Same with alcohol. Like alcohol is legal, but once you get behind the wheel, the states, including Colorado, have criminalized driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs.
Okay, sure. And so I guess then to continue my thought is in terms of relevance for the case, if it's if it's against a state where the law is admitted, then there's no relevance. But if it's still illegal federally and the case is a federal case, then it does have relevance?
Yes. So again, the state may not prosecute that, but the federal government may. And so, yeah, I could get into more detail about that, but that would take us down a line that I'm not going to test on. But yes, it still leaves the door open for federal agencies to prosecute that, like the U.S. Attorney's Office, for example, to prosecute that person, even though the state decides not to.
Cool.
All right. And let's see, Tirza, you've got your hand up too.
Yeah, so I actually have a question about the transportation because I had a dealing with this about 2 years ago with roommates who were actually mules for marijuana.
Oh, good.
And my dealing with the cop was because my stuff got trashed in the fight with them about this, that certain states actually have laws against bringing it across the border of the state. Is that legal for the states to do, especially because it's against federal law? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and we criminalize a lot, right? We'll get more to criminal law on Wednesday, but the U.S. criminalizes a lot of activity, and yeah. So the question is like, can states criminalize activity that the federal government hasn't? Well, sure. Now, can it conflict with federal law? That's more of a case-by-case question. But yeah, in general, yes, I'd say. And did I say your name right? Am I pronouncing it Tirza, or is that?
Yeah, you're saying it perfect.
Okay, I don't want to be an idiot. Okay, so let's see. Weston just raised his hand too.
Yeah, I know you probably don't want to spend too much time on this. I just have one last question.
Yeah.
For a case such as marijuana, where it is illegal at a federal level but not at a state level, is there still the potential and the possibility that FBI agents could go into Denver, Colorado and arrest individuals for using marijuana, or do they not have the authority in that situation?
They can do it. Acting under federal authority, that they could do that.
So there still could be the fear for citizens of Colorado that they're going to run into an FBI agent while they're smoking, and they could be tried for that for a criminal act.
Uh-huh. Now the federal laws deal with interstate, like transportation and stuff like that. So most people aren't concerned about it if they're using recreational marijuana in the state. That they're probably not worried about it. But yeah, the federal agents will track down transporting it across state lines, for example. That will violate the federal law.
Okay, thank you.
All right, cool. All right, so let me throw up the screen again. Oh, not that one, this one. Here with sure we're good here. Okay. I do just want to say one more thing about this slide, and that is in the Wickern case, the wheat case, right? And to understand the wheat case, it really comes down to, again, during the Great Depression, the federal government had a strong interest in controlling the price of wheat across the whole country. And so they put quotas, the federal government put quotas on how much wheat could be grown in the US. They then had an agency that would like distribute that number. If they said we can get 6 million bushels of wheat, or whatever a bushel means, but 6 million bushels of wheat across the US, then we're going to allocate certain amounts for each state that they can grow. And so it, like let's say that Wickern lived in Idaho, right? And Idaho was allocated was given the ability to grow 1 million bushels of wheat, and coming down, and then that would be distributed among the different counties in the state. And so when Wickern got his note from the federal government that said you're allowed to grow 20 bushels of wheat or something, he probably got mad because he could grow 300, right? And so you could see this. He was upset because this new regulation was constricting the amount of wheat that he was able to grow on his own land. So Mr. Wickern did what a lot of people would do. He said, okay, I'll grow 20 bushels on my land over here, but in my backyard, I'm going to grow my own wheat. And that's exactly what happened. And he grew additional lots of wheat because he had a lot of land. On his own private property, he grew a large amount of wheat. And his justification for that was like, look, I complied with the federal government's rule about how much I could grow on the farm. I'm just growing all this extra wheat here for my personal use. And like you read about, the federal government didn't agree with that. They said, why? Because if you're growing your own wheat, like let's extrapolate this further like we did with Heart of Atlanta Motel. If you're growing your own wheat, then you're not doing what? Well, you're not buying it. And if you're not buying it from Brolam's or Walmart or Vaughn's or whatever, wherever, like your local store, well, that's going to decrease the amount of demand on wheat, and that is going to have ripple effects on the economy, the overall price of wheat, which we are trying to control. So that's why the federal government, it was found permissible under the Commerce Clause to go in, knock down his wheat, and it affected his ability to grow his own wheat. So let's see. I just saw that it's 12:30. So if you need to jump off, feel free. I'm just going to finish this lecture. When I upload it to YouTube, by the way, remember you can always speed it. I speak so slow. I need to work on that. But yeah, feel free to jump out, but I'll just finish the rest of this lecture. So again, can the government regulate the wheat that you grow on your own property? Yes. Wickern learned that the hard way. And as a result of that case, if we jump back into our top hat question, that's why the answer here under the Commerce Clause is going to be that, yes, the federal government, even though it's for grandma's personal use, if the federal government passes a law about how many tomatoes can be grown in the country, it's, and pay attention to this, to the question here. It's, do you feel the government has the authority? Not should they, can they right now? It's does the government have the authority to do this? And the answer is yes. Now this angers a lot of my students because they're like, I live in America. Like I can grow whatever I want in my backyard. Well, yes, you can, until the federal government tells you that you can't anymore. And just like Wickern, this is one of those hard truths that the government does have the authority to regulate things that you're growing in your backyard. So let's jump back here and we'll talk about taxes. Again, the power to tax is in the Constitution. Please do not listen to, everybody has like that crazy uncle or aunt that is like, they have signs out front that say things like taxation is theft, and they'll try to make an argument that it's unconstitutional. Well, it's in the Constitution that the federal government has the ability to tax. And so this has been deemed constitutional by the Supreme Court many times. It's not really a question. Don't take constitutional advice from that crazy aunt or uncle. So again, the government has the ability to tax and to spend for the general welfare. So again, much like we talked about with Montana, they did have the ability to spend for the general welfare, the interstate of Montana, with strings attached, and that's just fine. Well, I don't know that it's fine, but it's constitutional. Now, this gets us into a great discussion about Obamacare, commonly known as Obamacare. Really, it's the Affordable Care Act, and this is something that is so fascinating that I just had to talk a little bit about this today, because again, some of you have family that are still saying Obamacare is unconstitutional. Well, it's not, because it went to the Supreme Court and they found that it was constitutional, though not for the reasons that President Obama thought. So here's what you need to know about the Affordable Care Act. When it was passed by President Obama, well, it wasn't passed by President Obama, it was passed by Congress, but pushed by President Obama, hence it's got his nickname. Most people call it Obamacare. The question came up very frequently, like, under what authority is the federal government going to pass a law that mandates, requires that all Americans have health insurance? And this got quite contentious. So Democrats who were arguing and pushing to pass this law argued that it was under the Commerce Clause. Why? Well, as the theory went, the Commerce Clause has been interpreted broadly, and if it affects interstate commerce, then it's going to be held as constitutional, right? So they said, if basically the argument that we had with Lopez, if people don't have insurance, then they don't have income security. If they don't have income security, then they may become a burden on the federal government if they declare bankruptcy, for example. And now we're talking about money, so Commerce Clause, right? Like that was the argument. And there weren't that many steps along the way. It wasn't like Lopez where it took 5 steps to get there. With health insurance, it's like health insurance deals with people's financial stability. It seems like Commerce Clause is going to apply. Well, Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act and immediately were sued by conservative groups saying that it was unconstitutional because this was too broad for the Commerce Clause. Now, their argument was interesting. They said, look, sure, it deals with money and financial security, and that's commerce. But this is different than everything else because this is requiring people to buy health insurance. Like now the federal government is going to require everybody in America to buy health insurance. And that seems like a little bit too much for the Commerce Clause. Even with Lopez, like it wasn't like we made Lopez go buy wheat from the store. And this is where things got interesting, right? Because President Obama said, and this clip that you can watch because you have the slides, I'd really recommend that you watch this clip of President Obama talking to Stephanopoulos about it, because President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, all the Democrat Party leaders were very adamant that it was based on the Commerce Clause, and yet they didn't have a really good argument as to why the government could force people to buy something. The best argument that they had, and one that President Obama uses in the clip, is that it's like auto insurance. If you want to drive, then you have to get auto insurance, and we require that, and that's legal. Well, the obvious response to that is, yeah, well, if you don't want to buy auto insurance, you just don't drive. You don't get a license, or you don't get a car. Whereas there's no similar argument with the health insurance issue, right? It's like if you don't want health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, well then don't live. Like it's not a very good comparison, and that is what made its way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, look, Commerce Clause isn't going to cut it. Now, the liberal justices were all fine. Like they were fine expanding the Commerce Clause to require Americans to buy something. They were fine with that. But there were 5 conservative justices that said, no, that's just too much. Like the Commerce Clause has to have some limits. And one of those should be that we can't force people to buy something. All right. So that means basically, like if we're relying just on the Commerce Clause, the Affordable Care Act would have been struck down as unconstitutional. Why? You would have had a 5-4 opinion. But it wasn't. It was found to be constitutional. But like I said, for all the reasons that President Obama didn't want, in this interview with Stephanopoulos kind of tries to nail him down and says, look, like you're saying, President Obama, that if people don't want to buy health insurance, that you are going to fine them. That sounds like a tax. Now, President Obama had campaigned on the fact that the Affordable Care Act would not result in a tax increase for Americans. So he was backed up into a corner and had to say, no, this isn't a tax. It's just insurance. It's Commerce Clause is going to be fine. But Stephanopoulos said, look, I don't think so. Like you're going to fine people if they don't get health insurance. That's a tax. And so when this went to the Supreme Court, those that were arguing for the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act were instructed by the federal government to say this isn't a tax. And in fact, in front of the Supreme Court, they said, nope, we're analyzing this under the Commerce Clause and not the taxing authority. Well, okay. So that being said, when the Supreme Court got the case, they said, look, you're arguing that it's not a tax, but it is. Like this is a tax. And so the 4 liberal justices combined with one of the conservative justices, so there's Chief Justice Roberts, who came over to join with them and said that the Affordable Care Act is constitutional under the federal government's authority to tax people. And that's so interesting because, again, President Obama and all the Democrats argued, even in front of the Supreme Court, this isn't a tax, just analyze it under the Commerce Clause authority. But the Supreme Court said, look, you're saying it's not, but it acts like a tax, it smells like a tax, all of that. And so therefore we're going to call it a tax. And then it was upheld as constitutional. Okay, so that's why, again, when people argue that the Affordable Care Act isn't constitutional, you can say, well, the Supreme Court found that it was because it's a tax. And again, that angers everybody. Like that makes conservatives angry and it makes liberals angry because it was a tax. But in the end of the day, they took it as a win. Now, the update to this is so interesting because when President Trump came into office, originally said he was going to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, but didn't have the votes to do it. So what did he do? Well, as the executive branch, as the head of the executive branch, he instructed the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service falls under the executive branch. He said not to enforce the penalties, not to assess penalties against people that don't have health insurance. And that's so important because what that did was undercut the constitutionality provision under the original Affordable Care Act as a tax. Well, now it's no longer a tax. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Because now if you don't get health insurance, you're not assessed a penalty anymore. So now you've got a situation, and this is what's working its way up to the Supreme Court as we speak, because conservatives, again, have brought a new lawsuit saying it's not a tax anymore because the IRS is not assessing any penalties for not having health insurance. So, Supreme Court, now you can say that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. And that, I think, is a pretty good argument. And that's what we're looking at right now. And again, we'll be able to watch this as it gets up to the Supreme Court. what they decide to do. All right. Any questions about this? I just think is fascinating. So any questions about that?
So, Brother Hales, I'm a little shaky on how the undercutting of it as a tax, just telling the IRS not to assess damages, like they can just do that just because they're the IRS. Like, what basis do they have to be able to say, well, we're just not gonna collect this tax?
Because like going back to the first slide of today, it's the executive branch's duty to enforce the laws. And that's an interesting authority, because it's not only the authority to enforce the law, but it's also the authority to not enforce the law. So if the executive branch decides not to enforce the law, is it really a law anymore? And that's where we get, but like, this is where we say probably not. Like it's probably not a law if it's not being enforced. And you've seen this, like you all of you have probably heard about these weird laws that exist in Montana. Like if you bring your horse to the bar, you can't, you have to string it up and not use a leather chain, but you just like weird laws that exist. I'm just shooting from the hip and coming up with stupid ideas, but there's weird laws on the books. And if they're not enforced, well, then they're probably not laws anymore. And so, yeah, that's the argument, Daniel. It's just that it's not enforced, so it's not a law anymore, and therefore it's unconstitutional because it's not a tax anymore.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right. Now, these last couple slides, I can kind of jump through this pretty quickly. Other constitutional law elements that apply to business. Well, one is freedom of speech. So again, First Amendment rights to say and say things and use your speech rights to say things that sometimes are offensive, right? And this first element right here of political versus commercial speech, as you might imagine, we give more rights to political speech as opposed to commercial speech. That makes sense. But what that really means is that we can limit sometimes commercial speech. And we see this most often with advertising. So we have advertising laws in the US that if you have misleading or outright lies in your commercial speech, meaning your advertisements, that we can limit that. If you wanted to add erotic material, nudity to your advertisements, sure, you could say, you know, I have freedom of speech, but there's some competing underlying and competing viewpoints on that the government has taken into account. And so as a result, yeah, you may claim freedom of speech to use pornography in your advertisements, but the government's going to say, you know, but you can't, right? Because other people have, we have other interests to protect, children and decency. And as a result, yeah, corporate speech can be limited. Now, let's get into, well, let's do this. Let's do another top hat question, right? So this one will get you thinking a little bit. So Rexburg Library, downtown-ish, if you can call downtown Rexburg. Downtown Rexburg, there's a little public library, and let's say that I take my kids there, and the library has problems with people going to the library to access pornography. Can the library keep other people from accessing pornography on the computers of the library in the library? All right, go ahead. You got 30 seconds left. All right, so let's see what we got. Some people just don't want to answer this, it looks like. All right, so if I pull this up, So most people believe that, yeah, the public library can keep people from accessing pornography in the library. And 2 people say it's okay to access pornography in the library. Anybody want to defend their answer here?
I don't know.
Somebody's like, no, I don't. Do you want me to just kind of show you what? Oh,
Well,
I'm not even sharing my screen. Sorry about that, guys.
well,
yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
My initial thought was actually no, that they couldn't filter pornographic material, but I chose yes because I was thinking about things like schools and other businesses that can enforce dress codes and the like, and so I think the freedom of speech extends to us as individuals, but it doesn't extend to, us as individuals under entities, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay, so and yeah, this if we were in class, I'd spend a lot of time on this and embarrass some people, but in in an effort not to do that, let me just kind of jump over here. The right answer is no. It's B. That the public library is not allowed to filter pornography. And you're confused, like, what the heck? What? How is that even possible? Well, the public library is a public entity, and so it kind of falls under this situation where as a public entity, it's not allowed to limit your rights and your speech rights. You're like, what does accessing pornography have to do with my speech rights? Well, again, long story. Take constitutional law in law school if you're interested in this. But the basic idea is that your speech is not only what you say, but it's also your actions, what you access, things that you search, and all of that. And so pornography can't be filtered on the public library in Rexburg, Idaho, or any city in the whole country. Now, can they block pornography to elementary schools and high schools? Yes. Why? Because those are accessed by children, and the school and the schools have an interest in not having kids look at pornography while they're at school. But a public library, on the other hand, is accessed by adults, and as a result of that, the Supreme Court has said, yeah, it's you have to allow them to be able to access pornography at the Rexburg Public Library. Now, maybe the library is allowed to put those computers in the back corner or something, so like any weirdo that's going to do that is going to go back there and away from the kids. Like, you don't want the computer right next to the Harry Potter section, and yeah, that would be weird.
Brother Hells?
Yeah.
I have a question with that. So, I know that from what I just looked up, porn is, you're not allowed to buy or be in possession of it if you're under the age of 18. So couldn't the library get around that law by putting on a blocker if, you have to put in what age you are?
Yeah, so, and I think that's possible. But you can see the problem with that too, right? Like you get on a computer and you're 17 or something and you want to access pornography. You just know you can put in 18. And that's why I think, I don't know, maybe libraries are doing this, but yeah, I think you're right. It can be limited to certain age groups, but you can't block it for everybody at a public library, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think the age-related questions are probably a good idea.
And then question for the school. So I used to work with the library and the Writing Center at BYUI.
Yeah.
And I know that they do have a private thing for the library. Like, there are certain things that you're not allowed to access. Are they able to do that because they're a private institution and able to make their own laws?
Yeah, so Tirza got where I was going. This is perfect. Because if you get called into the Honor Code office because you're looking at pornography in the library at BYU Idaho, if you go to the Honor Code office and say, look, Honor Code office, Brother Hales told me I can access pornography in the library, well, I'm going to smack you around a little bit, not physically, just, you know, I'm not threatening anybody. That's a horrible defense because like Tirza said, this is a private institution, and the question is specifically, the Top Hat question is specifically about public libraries where they can't do it, whereas we're a private institution at BYU Idaho. We can and we do block pornographic material on campus. So again, if your excuse is that, and then I get pulled into the honor code to explain my class to the honor code office, I'm not going to like you, okay? So just don't look at pornography. That's the lesson that I'm getting at today. Okay. All right. So let's see here. I think that is probably, like, for the other remaining slides, really just understand the difference between substantive and procedural due process. And then those last two slides, I'm not going to test on. So let's just end it, because otherwise I'm going to talk to you all for like 10 hours today, because it's an incredibly fascinating subject, but I'm trying to keep it limited just to business law. So let's go ahead and end it. I'll get this on YouTube when it finally uploads, this massive file. And otherwise, I'll get the recording out for Wednesday here in the next couple days, and I'll probably do a recording for Friday's class as well. So yeah, email me any questions, or just make an appointment on Calendly and we can set up a Zoom appointment. I'm happy to do that anytime with you guys. So yeah.
I just have one quick question. How do we sign up to be an expert?
Oh, so that's one of the announcements. Just go to the announcements and look for the one that says expert sign up. It'll take you to a Google Doc and you can just sign up for one there. All right, good question. Thanks everybody. Have a good one.
So